The first director of the Institute, Karl Grünberg, an Austrian economist, concluded his opening address, according to Martin Jay, by clearly stating his personal allegiance to Marxism as a scientific methodology. Marxism would be the ruling principle at the Institute, and that never changed. The initial work of the Institute was rather conventional, but in 1930 it acquired a new director named Max Horkheimer. And Horkheimer's views were very different. He was very much a Marxist renegade. In addition, overall, the people who create and form the Frankfurt School are renegade Marxists. They're still very much Marxist in their thinking, but they're effectively read out of the party. Moscow looks at what they're doing and says, wait a minute, this isn't us. We're not going to bless this. Horkheimer's initial heresy is he's very interested in Freud. And the key to making the translation of Marxism from economic into cultural terms is essentially that it combined it with Freudianism. Again, Martin Jay writes, if it can be said that in the early years of its history, the Institute concerned itself primarily with an analysis of bourgeois society's socio-economic substructure, and I'd point out that Jay is very sympathetic to the Frankfurt School. I'm not reading from a critic here. In the years after 1930, its prime interest lay in its cultural superstructure. Indeed, the traditional Marxist formula regarding the relation between the two was called into question by critical theory. The stuff we've been hearing about this morning, the radical feminism, the women's studies departments we see in universities, the gay study departments, the black studies departments, all of these things are branches of critical theory. What the Frankfurt School essentially does is, drawing on both Marx and Freud, in the 1930s, it creates a theory that it calls critical theory. The term is ingenious because you're tempted to ask and say, all right, what is the theory? The theory is to criticize. The theory is that the way to bring down Western culture and the capitalist order is not to lay out an alternative. They explicitly refuse to do that. They say it can't be done, that we can't not imagine what a free society would look like, their definition of free, as long as we're living under repression, the repression of a capitalist economic order which creates, in their theory, the Freudian condition, the conditions Freud describes in individuals of repression. That we cannot even imagine this. What the critical theory about is simply criticizing. It calls for the most destructive criticism possible in every possible way, designed to bring the current order down. And of course, when we hear about, again, these comments that feminists saying that, well, the whole of society today is just out to get women and so on, that kind of criticism is all a derivative of critical theory. It is all coming in the 1930s, not the 1960s. Other key members who join up around this time include Theodor Adorno, and most importantly, Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse. Fromm and Marcuse introduce an element which is now central to political correctness, and that's the sexual element. And particularly Marcuse, who in his own writings calls for a society of polymorphous perversity. That's his definition of the future they want to create. Marcuse, in particular, by the 30s, is writing some very extreme stuff on the need for sexual liberation. But this runs through the whole institute. So do most of the themes that we now see in political correctness. Again, as early as the 30s. In Erich Fromm's view, masculinity and femininity were not reflections of essential sexual differences, as the Romantics had thought. They were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined. Sex is a construct. Sexual differences are a construct. The emphasis we now see on environmentalism. Materialism, as far back as Hobbes, had led to a manipulative, dominating attitude towards nature. That was Horkheimer, writing in 1933 in Materialismus und Moral. The theme of man's domination of nature, according to Jay, was to become a central concern of the Frankfurt School in subsequent years. Horkheimer's antagonism, again in the 30s, to the fetishization of labor, here's where they're obviously departing from Marxist orthodoxy, expressed another dimension of his materialism, the demand for human sensual happiness. In one of his most trenchant essays, Egoism and the Movement for Emancipation, written in 1936, he discussed the hostility to personal gratification inherent in bourgeois culture. And he specifically referred to the Marquis de Sade favorably for his protest against asceticism in the name of a higher morality. How does all of this stuff come here? How does it flood into our universities? And indeed, into our lives today? The members of the Frankfurt School are Marxist. They're also, to a man, Jewish. In 1933, the Nazis come to power in Germany, and not surprisingly, they immediately shut down the Institute for Social Research. And its members flee. They flee to New York City, and the Institute is reestablished there in 1933 with help from Columbia University. And the members of the school, gradually through the 30s, though most of them continue to write in German, they gradually shift their focus from critical theory about German society, destructive criticism of every aspect of that society, to critical theory directed at American society. There is another very important translation. When the war comes, some of them go to work for the government, including Herbert Marcuse, who becomes a key figure in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and some, including Horkheimer and Adorno, move to Hollywood. These origins of political correctness would probably not mean much to us today, except for two subsequent events. The first was the student rebellion here in the mid-1960s, which was driven largely by resistance to the draft and to the Vietnam War. But the student rebels needed theory of some sort. They couldn't just get out there and say, hell no, we don't want to go. They had to have some theoretical explanation behind it. Very few of them were interested in wading through Das Kapital. Classical economic Marxism is not light, and most of the radicals of the 60s were not deep. Fortunately for them, and unfortunately for our country today, and not just in the universities, Herbert Marcuse remained in America when the Frankfurt School, after the war, relocates back to Frankfurt. And whereas Mr. Adorno and Horkheimer in Germany are appalled by the student rebellion when it breaks out there, when the student rebels come into Adorno's classroom, he calls the police and has them arrested. Herbert Marcuse, who remained here, saw the 60s student rebellion as the great chance. The opportunity to take the work of the Frankfurt School and make it the theory of a new left in the United States. And one of his books was the key book in this. It became virtually the Bible of the SDS and the student rebels of the 60s, and that book was Eros and Civilization. The essence of it is that Marcuse argues that under a capitalist order, he downplays the Marxism very, very strongly here. The book is subtitled A Philosophical Inquiry into Freud. But the framework is Marxist. He essentially argues that in a capitalist order, again, repression is the essence of that order, and that gives us the person Freud describes, the person with all the hang-ups, the neuroses, because his sexual instincts are repressed. That we can envision a future, if we can only destroy this existing oppressive order, in which we liberate eros, in which we liberate the libido, in which we have a world, again, his own phrase, of polymorphous perversity, in which you can do your own thing. And by the way, in that world, there will no longer be any work, there'll only be play. What a wonderful message for the radicals of the mid-60s. They're students. They're baby boomers. They've grown up never having to worry about anything except eventually having to get a job. And here comes along a guy who's writing in ways they can easily follow and doesn't require them to read a lot of heavy Marxism and tells them everything they want to hear, which is essentially, do your own thing. If it feels good, do it. You never have to go to work. And by the way, Marcuse is the man who creates the phrase, make love, not war. He also explicitly states, coming back to the situation people now face on campus, that he defines liberating tolerance as intolerance from any movement coming from the right and tolerance for any movement coming from the left. Marcuse, as I said, joins the Frankfurt School when? In 1932, if I remember right. So all of this goes back to the 1930s. In conclusion, America today is in the throes of the greatest and direst transformation in its history. We are becoming an ideological state, a state with an official state ideology enforced by the power of the state. In hate crimes, we now have people serving jail sentences for political thoughts. And the Congress is now moving to expand that category ever further. Affirmative action is part of it. The terror against anyone who dissents from political correctness on campus is part of it. It's exactly what we've seen happen in Russia, in Germany, in Italy, in China, and it's now coming here, and we don't recognize it because we just call it political correctness and laugh it off. My message this morning is it's not funny. It's here, it is growing apace, and it is eventually going to destroy, as it seeks to destroy, everything that we have ever defined as our freedom and our culture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to all our panelists. They were excellent. We have 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so if you would raise your hand, I'd love to have you ask our panelists anything you'd like. Since we have a lot of victim groups here today, I'm sure that a lot of you will. Yes, Wes.
Obviously, Bill, this whole thing that you discussed predates, if it predates the 60s, it certainly predates Bill Clinton's administration. But when you stop to think about it, does this not dovetail, this whole cultural Marxism and political correctness and controlling of thought and controlling of speech, dovetail into such things as the FBI files, the IRS audits, truth is whatever you want it to be, harassing ordinary citizens who heckle the president, and that sort of thing. And isn't this combination such that it might be perfect, ripe for the timing of forming some kind of grassroots movement against this kind of blatant oppression?
Well, let me say, first of all, the Clinton administration, Clinton is the first baby boomer president. So it's not surprising that this administration would be steeped in PC. But I would note that this has now spread so far through the establishment. Virtually, it's now a rule. If you're going to be a member of the establishment, you must be politically correct. The last Republican convention that nominated Bob Dole was choreographed for political correctness. And those who didn't share that view were explicitly invited to leave, which they did in the voting booth as well. There's no question that the grassroots is sick of this stuff. Americans don't want to have to be afraid of what they think, of what they say, of what they write, of saying the wrong thing and being in trouble with some kind of legal or quasi-legal authority for doing it. I think the potential is there for a grassroots resistance movement. I think the most important thing to do is break the Frankfurt School's own silence. Again, it was very, very careful to disguise its origins, initially in Germany, but then much more so when it came here, and to disguise its Marxism. And if the average American realizes that this stuff is Marxism, that it's a heretical school of it, but it is totally Marxist in its origins, then the light bulb will go on, and he'll realize what he's dealing with.